The Herdmans were absolutely the worst kids in the history of the world. They lied and stole and smoked cigars and hit little kids and cussed their teachers and set fire to Fred Shoemaker's old broken-down tool house. I was in the same grade with Imogene Herdman, and what I did was stay out of her way. You couldn't do it if you were very pretty or very ugly or very smart or very dumb or had anything unusual about you, like red hair or double-jointed thumbs. But if you were a medium kid like me and you kept your mouth shut, you did okay. As far as anyone could tell, Imogene was just like the rest of the Herdmans. She never learned anything either, except bad words and secrets about everybody. It was no good trying to get secrets on the Herdmans. Everybody already knew about the awful things they did. You couldn't even tease them about their parents or holler, "Your father's in jail," because they didn't care. Actually, they didn't know what their father was or where he was or anything about him because when the youngest Herdman, Gladys, was 2 years old, he climbed on a train and disappeared. Nobody blamed him. Mrs. Herdman worked double shifts at the shoe factory and wasn't home much, so the Herdmans pretty much looked after themselves. The big Herdmans taught the little ones everything they knew. And the proof of that was that the feistiest Herdman of all was Gladys, the youngest. We figured they were all headed straight for the state penitentiary until they got mixed up with church, and my mother, and our Christmas pageant. My brother Charlie had told the Herdmans that there would be cake at the rehearsal, and suddenly they all wanted to be in the Christmas pageant. At the first meeting, my mother started asking for volunteers.
I know many of you would like to be Mary in our pageant, but of course we can only have one Mary. So I'll ask for volunteers and then we'll decide together which girl should play the part.
It was pretty safe to say, since the only person who ever raised her hand was Alice Windlekin, but Alice sat there just twirling a piece of hair and looking down at the floor, and the only person who raised her hand this time was Imogene Herdman.
Do you have a question, Imogene?
No, I want to be Mary, and Ralph wants to be Joseph. Mother just stared at them. She couldn't believe this. What she didn't know was that Imogene had bullied Alice into letting her be Mary, and Elmer Hopkins was relieved he didn't have to be Joseph again, and was just fine that Ralph would do it without being bribed. Nobody volunteered to be Wiseman either, except Leroy, Claude, and Ollie Herdman. So there was my mother, stuck with a pageant full of Herdmans in the main roles. So Mother called the first rehearsal. Everyone shut up right away for fear of missing something awful the Herdmans might do. Leroy had already knuckled Charlie behind the ear, and a little girl yelled when Gladys went by. But Mother said she was going to ignore everything except blood, and the little girl was not bleeding. Even so, right away, Mother ran into trouble.
Who are the shepherds? Where did they come from?
What was the inn?
It's like a motel where people go to spend the night.
What people? Jesus?
Oh, honestly, Jesus wasn't even born yet. Mary and Joseph went there.
What happened? Begin at the beginning. The thing was, the Herdmans didn't know anything about the Christmas story. They knew Christmas was Jesus' birthday, but everything else was news to them. The shepherd, the wise men, the star, the stable, the crowded inn. So Mother said they had better begin by reading the story from the Bible. This was a pain in the neck for most of us because we knew the whole thing backward and forward. When Mother finished, the Herdmans pommeled her with questions. You mean there wasn't any room in the inn? Not even for Jesus?
Well, now, after all, nobody knew the baby was going to turn out to be Jesus.
You said Mary knew. Why didn't she tell them?
I would have told them. Boy, would I. What's the matter with Joseph that he didn't tell him? Her being pregnant and everything.
What was they laid the baby in? The manger? Is that like a bed? Why would they have a bed in a barn?
That's just the point. They didn't have a bed in the barn, so Mary and Joseph had to use whatever there was. What would you do if you had a new baby and no bed to put the baby in?
We put Gladys in a dresser drawer.
Well, there you are. You had to use something else like Mary did. A manger is a wooden feeding trough for animals.
What about the wadded up clothes?
The what?
You read it. She wrapped him in wadded up clothes.
Oh, you mean the swaddling clothes. Long ago, people used to wrap babies very tightly in big pieces of material to make babies feel cozy.
Why didn't Mary get to name the baby?
I named them.
I would have named him Bill. What'd the angel say? Just name him Jesus? Mother was in a hurry, so she just said yes. But then Alice Windlekin had to open her big mouth and announce,
The angel said, His name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace.
What? He never got out of first grade if he had to write all that. And so it went, Mother telling the story and explaining it to the Herdmans. They were really interested in Herod. When Mother said Herod planned to put baby Jesus to death, Imogene exclaimed, "Are you kidding? He just born and already they're out to kill him?" I figured they were so interested in Herod because they liked him. He was so mean he could have been their ancestor, Herod Herdman. But I was wrong. They wanted somebody to be Herod in the play so they could beat up on him. Actually, the Herdmans got very involved in the Christmas story. They wanted a bloody end to Herod, were worried about Mary having a baby in a barn, and called the wise men a bunch of dirty spies. After Mother finished the story, we at least got through the first rehearsal. During the second rehearsal, Mrs. McCarthy called the fire department because she smelled smoke in the women's washroom. It just turned out to be Imogene smoking cigars during a break in the rehearsal. But while everyone was milling around, the applesauce cake the ladies on the potluck committee were baking really did burn up. When Reverend Hopkins heard about the fire, he asked Mother if we should call off the whole pageant. He didn't know if anyone would come, but he was wrong. Everybody came to see what the Herdmans would do. The night of the pageant, there was the usual mess all over the place. Angel wings poking people, shepherd sword fighting with their shepherd staffs, and grumpy kings tripping over their long costumes. But everything settled down, and by 7:30, the pageant began. When we were finished singing O Little Town of Bethlehem, Ralph and Imogene came in. Only for once, they didn't barge through the door, pushing and shoving each other. They took their places and looked for a minute, as if they weren't sure they were in the right spot. Because of the spotlights, I guess, and the church being full of people. They look like people you see on the 6 o'clock news, refugees in some strange and ugly place, with all their boxes and sacks around them. It suddenly occurred to me that this was just the way it must have been for the Holy Family, stuck away in a barn by people who didn't care much for what happened to them. They couldn't have been very neat and tidy either, but more like this, Mary and Joseph. Anyway, next came Gladys from behind some kids, pushing people out of the way, not caring if she was stepping on anyone's feet or costume. Since she was the only one in the pageant with a speaking part, she made the most of it. She hollered,
"Hey, unto you a child is born!"
Then the wise men came in. Whatever Leroy, the first one, was carrying, it was heavy. Leroy almost dropped it, and it was a ham. Right away, I knew where it came from. My father was on the church charitable works committee, and they gave away food baskets at Christmas. This was the Herdmans' food basket ham. The Herdmans had never before in their lives given anything to anyone except lumps on the head, so you had to be impressed. When it was time for the wise men to leave the stage, the Herdmans either forgot or didn't want to because they didn't leave, and no one could do anything about it. As a matter of fact, it made perfect sense for the wise men to rest a while. They had come a long way. As for ruining the whole thing, it seemed to me the Herdmans had improved the pageant a lot just by coming and doing what came naturally to them, like Imogene burping the baby Jesus, or thinking a ham would be a better present than a lot of perfumed oil. I almost wish the pageant would go on with the Herdmans in charge to see what else they would do that was different. Maybe the wise men would tell Mary about their problems with Herod, or Joseph would go with them and get rid of nasty Herod once and for all. I was so busy planning ways to save baby Jesus that I didn't notice Imogene at first. When I did, I almost dropped my hymn book on baby angel. Imogene Herdman was crying. In the candlelight, her face was all shiny with tears, and she didn't even bother to wipe them away. She just sat there, awful old Imogene, in her crookedy veil, crying and crying and crying. I guess Christmas just came over her all at once, like a case of the chills and fever, and so she was crying. Well, it was the best Christmas pageant ever. Everybody said something was special about it, but they couldn't put their finger on just what. Now, whenever I think of the Christmas story, Mary is always going to look a lot like Imogene Herdman, sort of nervous and bewildered, but ready to clobber anyone who lays a hand on her baby. And the wise men are always going to be Leroy and his brothers, bearing ham. When we came out of the church that night, it was cold and clear, with crunchy snow underfoot and bright, bright stars overhead. And I thought about the angel of the Lord, Gladys, with her jeans and boots sticking out from under her angel robe, yelling at all of us everywhere,
"Hey, unto you a child is born!"